Okay. Hello, and welcome to ScrapTV, the video forum for the ISRI and Scrap Magazine websites. I'm Kent Kaiser, your ScrapTV host, and I'm here today with Herschel Cutler, former Executive Director of ISRI. Herschel is here today as the recipient of the ISRI Lifetime Achievement Award. Herschel is a significant figure in the association history. He was Executive Director of ISRI for 10 years and Executive Director of the Institute of Scrap Iron and Steel, an ISRI predecessor, for 16 years prior to that. He led the association through numerous challenges, including on issues such as transportation, freight rates, environmental regulations, export controls, and numerous others. Well, first off, thank you for joining me here today, Herschel.
Pleasure being here.
And congratulations very much on your Lifetime Achievement Award.
Thank you.
Can you tell me, were you surprised to receive the award?
Surprised would be the word. I was totally unexpected, and when I got the call from Chairman Luan, I was pleased, very pleased, but as you say in the question, very surprised.
That's great. And how would you say it feels now, after you've received the award, to be recognized this way by the industry?
The recognition and the award gave me the opportunity to come back to a convention, and the fun of the convention was seeing so many people that were a major part of my life for so many years. So I've thoroughly enjoyed today, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the recognition. As I said in my acknowledgement, all of the credit isn't due to me, certainly not at all. Most of the credit is the membership that was willing to support the programs that we undertook. The leadership of the association was phenomenal in supporting it, and I think I used the word amazing for the staff, who were literally amazing and made it all work. So.
Thank you. Well, now how did you get started with the Institute of Scrap Iron and Steel? Can you tell us a little bit about your the beginning story?
Most colleges and universities have rules about moonlighting. I was fortunate. I was teaching at American University, and the dean of the business school had a different attitude. His attitude was, you can sit in an ivory tower and teach by what you had learned, or you could go out in the world and experience it and then add that experience to book learning. And so I decided to go into the consulting business. As well as being, at that point, an associate professor. My first client, for a number of weird reasons, was the Institute of Scrap Iron and Steel, and it all began that way.
Oh. And what were you doing for them in the beginning?
It was all transportation-related activity. The ferrous industry at that time, ferrous scrap industry at that time, was burdened with terribly discriminatory railroad freight rates, and most of the scrap moved via rail. It was the classic captive shipper where you had no choice. The railroads were very much aware of that, and so the pricing structure reflected the fact you had no choice. And when they presented the idea to me it was in the context of one of the ex parte or the general freight rate increase cases, whether I could present a program to the ICC to challenge it. I said I would be willing to do that, I'd be interested in doing that, but I needed some background on the steel industry. I had no idea what the steel industry did or how they did it, and so I managed to convince the leadership of the association at that point to send me for 3 or 4 days to Battelle Institute in Columbus, Ohio, and take a very quick course in steelmaking. And they were 4 very long 8-hour days. But by the time I left, I had a working knowledge of how steel was made. And then it became relatively easy to create equivalences of iron ore, limestone, and coke versus ferrous scrap, and then evaluate what the rates should have been versus what they were based on the conversion of iron units into new steel. And it was kind of an unusual approach, but I presented it to the ICC, and we won millions of dollars in the first case, because it was in those days the ICC was very concerned with what they called discriminatory pricing. And I could demonstrate that this was discriminatory of the value of the competing materials. That began a series. Then we stopped the increase, and then we went back to get the reductions. And that went on for almost 5 years, because the basic discrimination was so bad, you just take pieces of it each time. And that's how it all began.
So at what period and point did you become executive director, and is there a story behind that?
It was in 1972. I guess the story, if there is a story, was that my predecessor went to private consulting and left the association, and then I thought I would just continue in the role that I had. I loved teaching school, and at the moment I can't tell you which of the officers approached me, because I don't remember, but I was approached on a number of occasions to put my hat in. I had long talks with myself and decided, why not? And then was sort of like your first question, I was surprised when they said, we'd like you to do it. So that's how it all happened.
Excellent. Well, now, besides the transportation rate issues, any other issues and memories you recall from the ISIS years that were most notable?
I guess from the point of view of notoriety, was the involvement of the graduate class in the law school, not the graduate class, the law school class, who took what is called the scrap case all the way to the Supreme Court. But Professor Bansaf at GW called one day, and he said he was intrigued by the work we had done up to now on trying to build equity between the two ways of making steel, or the two components of making steel, and he sent over they formed a 5-man group of all, I think it was second-year law students, but I could be off on that. And they came over, and we spent a huge amount of time briefing them on it, and then they took the case. Ironically, they won the case about roughly, as I recall, 3 or 4 months before the whole structure of freight rates disappeared. And so it went from regulation in the ICC to deregulation and no ICC. And rather than put the railroad industry through having to revise all their tariffs and everything else, it just went away. So it was one of those incredible victories, but at the involvement of a whole bunch of lawyers who stayed very interested. As a matter of fact, I still am in contact with 2 of those 5 lawyers who went on to some very big things.
Very interesting. Well, now, after ISIS merged with the National Association of Recycling Industries in 1987...
If I can interrupt you for a second, the other thing that happened was export controls.
Oh, okay.
And that was a major issue starting relatively soon after I moved into the position, where a part of the steel industry was able to convince the Department of Commerce that because of alleged supply shortages, which was the rationale for challenging higher prices, was able to get controls put into effect. It took, my timing may be off a little bit, but I think it took almost 2 years to get the controls removed. But we realized once the free market was back into functioning that the way the Export Administration Act was written would be relatively easy for somebody to do it again. And so we undertook a major program, which I think was in 77, in that area, of working to amend the Export Administration Act to make it that much more difficult if you ever tried it again. We were successful in getting the act amended, and I can't testify to what's happened since 2001, but certainly for the rest of my time, there was never another export control, even an attempt. Well, I take it back. There was one attempt. Being in New Orleans reminds me of this. One of the features that we built into the Export Administration Act was the Secretary of Commerce would have to hold hearings in various parts of the country if there was a request to put in controls again. And there, what commodity it was, I don't remember. It must have been some form of scrap. But we proceeded to testify in 5 or 6 different cities across the country. The final one, I remember it started in Washington and ended in San Francisco. And we were successful in precluding it because of the system that we had created, which is still the way it functions in the Export Administration Act.
Excellent. Well, now, do you want to say anything about the ICE's 50th anniversary? I know there was something big that happened around then, too.
Those were fascinating days with having met and learned an awful lot about sculpture and artistry. I remember the board meeting where they decided to sponsor a piece of art, an original piece of art, and that hopefully it would be shown for a long time at the Herschel Museum. I was then asked to go to the museum and make this proposal, which to a layperson seemed somewhat outlandish to convince an organization of that stature to, it had to be sight unseen, and it had to be displayed prominently at the museum. And I don't think I will ever forget going into the office of the director of the museum and totally expecting to be told the door was right there. And rather than that, he said he would love to do it. And from that, we had a committee appointed within Israel, and they went and jointly with the Herschel developed a list of possible sculptors whose work would be acceptable sight unseen, that whatever they put together would be placed there. And then without understanding how people do these things in the art world, they gave me a list of 5. I took the first name on there and I called them, which is not the way you're supposed to do this. You're supposed to go through an agent and a whole lot of other things. Mark DeSuvero answered the phone. I told him what I wanted to do and he said fine. And that was the way it was done. His agent then came along and we decided on the fees and everything else. But Mark, unbeknownst to me and except for a few people in the industry, had his start with the help of the industry. Mark was an immigrant with limited funds, but was an expert welder. And so he would trade scrap and a place to work on his sculpture for welding in the scrap facilities. And so we had an affinity, and as we traveled the country, people did remember him. As the other requirement was that Israel would pay for all the scrap, but he could go to any facility he wanted in the entire country and pick out the pieces that he wanted. And it worked out very well, that no one could identify, the industry could identify, but not any one processor. There's some wonderful stories, but I won't bother you with that.
All right.
It was an amazing achievement. We actually went to the White House the day before the dedication occurred. The dedication itself was, I think, something like 3/4 of the Congress was there. It was a nighttime event on the deck of the Herschel. NBC News, for the 2 weeks that it was being built, we were on the Today Show every morning showing the status of what happened. It was an incredible undertaking and something for which I was entirely unprepared and learned as we went along the way.
Sounded like a great success, though.
It worked out very well.
Excellent. All right, let's get the other question that we were just starting about. After ISIS merging with NARI to form ISRI in 1987, you became the first executive director of ISRI. What defining memories do you have of your 10 years serving in that position?
There are a number of memories, but you use the term defining, it would have to be super fun. It became the reason, the motivating force for basically everything we did during that 10-year period. The problem was rapidly becoming the potential to pretty much destroy the industry as we knew it unconstrained, unrestrained. No one could avoid liability because hazardous substances as defined were going to be in everything. And the support of the membership, the support of the leadership, the incredible support of the staff, it just welded into a focus that culminated at the turn of the century with a success. Some of the comments of people along the way, and in many instances people who opposed us, was that ISRI had been able to work itself into the position of being possibly the most significant lobbying force on Superfund at that time. And the result is that the most significant achievement, I think, in that Superfund reauthorization or the Superfund activity was our bill, the Superfund Recycling Equity Act, which provided coverage for the industry if they followed the rules that everyone agreed were reasonable. And I think that clearly was a defining part of 10 years.
Excellent. No, that was an amazing feat. Well, now looking back, what did you find most challenging about serving as executive director of ISIS and ISRI?
That's a very difficult question. The most challenging, maintaining interest on the part of the people the industry we were representing was difficult. But I think the creativity of the staff in particular pretty much muted that as a concern. We didn't have to create problems, they were there. And it was a matter of interpreting, translating what the problem was so that everybody could understand the need to participate and address it. And I think the chapter system was very helpful in that regard. It was not just me, but many of the senior staff were traveling all the time to the various chapters, and you could one-on-one present these issues rather than relying on a printed word, which was very difficult. So I think the structure of the association helped a great deal. And I hope the chapter system is still doing what it did for us, or for me certainly at that time.
Excellent. Okay. And on the other hand, what did you find most rewarding about serving in those positions?
Well, on a personal note, it was making literally hundreds of friends, getting to know the processors, brokers, and many consumers on a personal basis, understanding the problems of the industry, understanding the relationships between competitors or between buyers and sellers. It's a very, I think the association is the center of a very human business. And it's one-on-one businesses all the time. The convention is an example of it, if people get together to shake hands and see each other. And I think to the extent I was helpful, we try to make the association of that same model. And it almost, to me, in many instances, felt like a big family.
Excellent. No, that's absolutely true. Now, when you stepped down as executive director in '97, you continued working for 4 more years as senior advisor. So after 2001, what did you do after that point until today?
Let me correct one thing. I think it was 2 years as senior advisor, but
was it? Okay.
I could be wrong. You're going back many years now for somebody at my age.
Check our facts.
You could be right. You could be right, and I would admit it in advance. Your question was?
It was about what have you done after leaving the association world, so to speak?
I was always intrigued by the insurance program that ISIS and ISRI had, and I was approached by RecycleGuard. Would I help them try to enlarge the program, which was quite large, but there was obviously a lot of potential that hadn't been reached. And so for, as I recall, 5 years, maybe 6 years, I spent a lot of time traveling to facilities, trying to bring to the attention of the decision makers in these various companies to at least evaluate what RecycleGuard was offering. And I think to a great extent it was an awareness undertaking. You still purchase through the local agent, but bring another alternative to bear. And the fact that RecycleGuard is still apparently a significant sponsor sort of suggests it may have been fruitful. In addition to that, I went back to teaching part-time and taught at AU and at Maryland both for another 5 or 6 years. And then through a series of strange coincidences, I was asked to join a senior professor at Kellogg, a school at Northwestern University, in writing a case dealing with Superfund and the Superfund success that ISRI had. The case we wrote it over one summer. It is now part of the curriculum at Kellogg, and it is also part of the Harvard Business School case study program. And it's all about the significant victory of ISRI on Superfund.
Very cool. Definitely is a story worth retelling.
Yeah.
Well, now, Herschel, looking back on your long involvement with this industry, what are some of your fondest memories and proudest moments, would you say?
Well, the fondest memories are people, absolutely people. And even though I've been away from the association and most of the industry for 16 years, I walk in today and there are people, it's as if we had been talking on the phone yesterday afternoon. So clearly the fondest memories are people. And in a way, the happiness that we were able to help bring to those people by winning these significant achievements. So I think the simplest answer is trying to get members to smile. And the success was that they did. And I would guess that's the best part of having been in the seat I was.
Excellent, excellent. All right, last question for you. Besides some of the things you just mentioned of what you're doing, but what else keeps you busy and engaged these days? How else do you spend your time?
Well, certainly number one on the list are 4 grandchildren, and I see them at least twice a week. I've become a cook in my old age, and I'm very lucky that they like the food that I cook. So I see them at least for 2 dinners a week, and then a whole lot of other things as well. I still love to go fishing, and that hasn't changed. And I'm pretty well involved in a number of community events. So it's not a question of finding things to do, it's a question of finding time to get them in.
Well, that's all I had, Herschel, but thank you so much for talking with me today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.